Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a very interesting story out of the state of Georgia where Governor Brian Kemp is reportedly pushing Derek Dooley as a potential Republican candidate for Senate in the state against Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff. So if you're unfamiliar, here's a little bit of backstory on this. Governor Brian Kemp is making a late push to help lay the groundwork for former football coach Derek Dooley's U.S. Senate bid, directly telling Insurance Commissioner John King and U.S. Representative Mike Collins and Buddy Carter that he won't support their campaigns. And before I read any further, this article is by Greg Bluestein as well. I just want to make that noted. I believe it is the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So Kemp privately met with King Thursday to reinforce his support for Dooley, citing the commissioner's sluggish fundraising and limited traction thus far. He also called Collins, who is expected to enter the race within the next few days, Thursday to deliver a similar message about his support for Dooley. The conversation was described as cordial by allies close to both figures. Collins reminded Kemp of his past support and said he looked forward to uniting with the governor if he secures the nomination. Kemp also phoned Carter, who has promised to self-finance his own campaign, to make clear that he would back Dooley instead. Aides to Carter, Collins, Kemp, and King did not immediately comment. Collins spent the weekend lining up endorsements for his expected announcement, while Carter and King have been in the race for a few months now. Kemp has urged major GOP donors to hold off until he and President Donald Trump can rally behind a single contender, but the prospect of that happening is dimming. The GOP primary threatens to reopen an old party rift between Kemp and Trump if they don't get behind the same candidate. The two have discussed the race several times, and some Republicans hope they'll find a common ground to avoid bruising internal fights that dominated past GOP campaigns. Dooley's campaign is touting his outsider credentials and crossover appeal. Several of Kemp's top advisors have already signed onto his team, giving the former coach instant credibility with party insiders. Still, though, some Republicans are reportedly uneasy. Dooley has never run for office and has never been an outspoken Trump supporter of Trump or his politics, and has said little about his policy positions since first raising doubts about how he'd fare in a high-stakes, high-dollar campaign. Democrats are already highlighting Dooley's spotty voting record, which includes several skipped GOP primaries in recent elections, while blasting him as a, quote, former mediocre Tennessee football coach. That's definitely some fighting words, calling a football coach mediocre. So that's what the article says. This is a very interesting situation happening here, because Georgia is Democratic incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff. He is running for re-election, and for a while now, the prospect of this race looked like it was going to be very close, where Ossoff was going for a tough re-election in a state that Donald Trump did win in 2024. But initially, the prospect was that Governor of the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp, was considering potentially running against Ossoff. That would be a situation very similar to North Carolina, where you either have the governor or former governor of the state running against the incumbent senator of the opposite party, where Roy Cooper is going to run for Senate in North Carolina against Tom Tillis. Brian Kemp is going to run for Senate against the incumbent senator, Jon Ossoff. So it's kind of like the inverse of North Carolina. However, both things go very differently here. Obviously, Tom Tillis just said he's not running for re-election a few months ago, but also Brian Kemp said he would not be running for Senate in 2026. So what looked like would be a very strong possibility of Republicans flipping the seat, and based on the early polling data, without really not too much of a struggle early on, where all the Republicans were losing to Jon Ossoff, except for Brian Kemp, who at very least early on started out with about a 3 to 4 point lead over Jon Ossoff in a lot of the early polling. Again, this is very similar to what Roy Cooper was doing to Tom Tillis in a lot of the early polls, about a 3 to 4 point lead. So it looked like Kemp was almost probably guaranteed to win this Senate race in some regard. It's possible it could have narrowed up, but Kemp looked like he had a strong chance at winning. However, Kemp officially decided not to run for this race. So now the Republicans are left scrambling to try and find a candidate they can run and unite behind to go up against the Democratic incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff, who Jon Ossoff is a very formidable Democratic candidate. He has already raised over almost $42 million and has about $15.5 million cash on hand. So he is fundraising like a Democratic incumbent in a swing state, knowing this is going to be a very tough fight, and it looks like he's being put up in a very strong position to run for re-election. Now, the Republicans, however, are currently left scrambling at this time. 3 Republicans are in the race: Reagan Boggs, Buddy Carter, a U.S. Representative, and John King, the Georgia Insurance Commissioner. However, I would bet on all 3 of them likely not becoming the Republican nominee, seeing as they've all been in the race for at least a few months now, and both either President Trump or Governor Brian Kemp have refused to endorse any of these three candidates, which suggests to me that they're probably not going to start off with too much support in a Republican primary. Now, what's interesting is U.S. Representative Mike Collins. His announcement is pending. I've done a video on him a few days ago. He's likely entering this race, and he is the leading Republican right now that's expected to get the endorsement of President Trump. It's possible everything could change. Everything's very volatile. But Mike Collins right now is the most likely Republican to receive the endorsement of President Trump. Now, we just went over the article. Derek Dooley, who is also expected to enter this race, is expected to get the endorsement of Governor Brian Kemp. So unless something changes, we will have another President Trump versus Governor Brian Kemp proxy war happening in the Republican primary in Georgia. And that's certainly not a good situation the Republicans are going to be in for the Senate race, because Jon Ossoff is going to start off at a very high level of support in the state of Georgia. For the Republicans to even have a chance at defeating Ossoff in 2026, the Republicans are going to need a 100% completely unified front against Ossoff, where basically no Republicans in the state are dissatisfied with who the candidate is going to be. And even then, it still may not be enough to defeat Ossoff, but that gives the Republicans the strongest chance. If there's going to be a competitive primary between Collins and between Dooley, with President Trump and Brian Kemp giving dueling endorsements, I think that gives a very strong chance that Jon Ossoff will win re-election pretty much guaranteed. Now, again, not everything is set in stone, but it's looking like Collins and Dooley are the likeliest candidates to receive the endorsement of President Trump. There are some other Republican candidates who are allies of both President Trump and Brian Kemp that are listed as potential candidates, like Brad Raffensperger, Kelly Loeffler, U.S. Representative Brian Jack, and Doug Collins, U.S. Secretary of Veteran Affairs. But again, there hasn't been any specific information mentioned on them running in this race. So for now, Derek Dooley and Mike Collins seem to be the top two choices on that front. As for how things have played out in the hypothetical Republican primary, Marjorie Taylor Greene was also considering a run for a while. She led in the one poll she was in. The other Trafalgar poll that did not include Marjorie Taylor Greene showed Mike Collins at 46%, Buddy Carter at 23%, McCormick at 21%, John King at 11%. So again, it looks like without Derek Dooley in the race, Mike Collins will be the Republican nominee without too much of a question. The problem is going to be, though, for Collins is, with Collins getting the endorsement of President Trump and Dooley getting the endorsement of Brian Kemp, that could set off a very interesting primary fight where things could get very competitive between Collins and Dooley in this race. Now, for this general election, Inside Elections, Cook Political Report, and Sablo Crystal Ball have the race listed as a battleground or a toss-up in all three of them. Race to the White House has it listed as lean Democrat. And as I was kind of talking about earlier, you see for Buddy Carter and John King thus far, it's not really a close race. Jon Ossoff is leading by 7 points in the most recent Signal poll. Their poll back in May had him up by 4. Tyson's group had him up by about 8. WPA had him up by 13. Jon Ossoff is beating Buddy Carter, and by a lot. For Buddy Carter to win, he would essentially have to win pretty much all of the undecided vote, which is just not going to happen. John King is not faring any better. He's losing in the Signal poll by 10 points and by 3 points in the one before that. Two polls for Ossoff versus King shows Ossoff breaking 50%. Now, one Republican who does poll pretty strongly based on the most recent poll is Brad Raffensperger. However, again, as I mentioned, there has not been any indication that Brad Raffensperger is going to enter this race versus Jon Ossoff. Brian Kemp, as I mentioned, was also polling the strongest against Jon Ossoff. He was the only Republican that looked like, starting out, had a legitimate chance at beating him. Marjorie Taylor Greene was getting demolished. Mike Collins is a little bit more of an interesting story, because Mike Collins doesn't have too many polls against him versus Jon Ossoff, but he does have 2 from Signal and Trafalgar, 2 both Republican pollsters, and they showed competitive races, but Jon Ossoff still leading. Signal had Ossoff at 46, Collins at 43, with 11% undecided. There's a little bit of an opening there for Collins to win this race, but Ossoff, I would still say, starts out with the advantage. Trafalgar is that even more, with 48% starting out for Ossoff, Collins getting 43, 3% saying other, 6% undecided. An Ossoff versus Mike Collins matchup, to me, just screams a potential runoff in Georgia, where neither candidate breaks 50% and it goes to a 1v1 head-to-head election in early January. I think Ossoff versus Collins right now looks like that would probably happen. The only poll for Ossoff versus Derek Dooley came from the middle of June, and it showed Ossoff leading Dooley 50-41 with 9% undecided. So again, it's possible that race could narrow up, but again, it looks like Ossoff versus Dooley starts out with Ossoff leading. Though being only one poll, there's not really too much to take away from that. If there was 2 or 3 other polls showing that trend as well, then maybe we'll have more of a consistent polling trend in that one. But bottom line is it looks like Jon Ossoff starts out as the clear favorite. And Georgia's a very interesting state because at the presidential level, it voted for Donald Trump by 2.2% in 2024. Kind of in the middle between like being some of the narrowest and the largest toss-up states in 2024, Georgia was kind of right smack in the middle, where Nevada was about 3 points, Wisconsin was less than 1, Michigan was 1.4, Pennsylvania 1.7, North Carolina 3.2, Georgia was only 2.2, so it was very close. And that was after 2020 when Joe Biden kind of shockingly defeating Donald Trump in the state of Georgia by 0.24%. In 2016, Trump won the state by 5.1%. So Georgia's an interesting state that's certainly trending more towards the Democratic direction in recent years. In the Senate races, it's kind of like that, even accelerated. Raphael Warnock defeated Republican Herschel Walker in the runoff election by 2.8% in 2022. On the first round of voting, Warnock got 49.44%, Walker got 48.49%. So neither candidate was able to break 50% of the vote, and it ended up going to a runoff. And this is, I think, something that could very well happen again in 2026. Even though Ossoff seems to be in a strong position for re-election, I think neither candidate breaking 50% on the first ballot seems to be something that's very possible for 2026. Now, in the other Senate race back in 2020, there were 2. Raphael Warnock Senate race, which is a special election, and the Georgia Senate race, which was held by Republican David Perdue versus Democrat Jon Ossoff. Now, obviously, if you're watching this video, you'll know that Jon Ossoff won the Senate race, but you may not know the full story behind it. So in the first round of balloting, it actually happened where David Perdue, the Republican, technically won, but Georgia's election law states that the winning candidate must break 50% of the vote. But in the first ballot, David Perdue did get more votes than Jon Ossoff did. Ossoff getting around 48%, David Perdue getting around 49.7% or so. But no candidate was able to break 50%, so they had to go to a runoff. And what you see here is roughly 250,000 voters that voted for Perdue in the election night in November did not vote for him on the runoff, where Jon Ossoff only lost about 100,000 voters. So Ossoff was able to get 50.6% of the vote to produce 49.4%. It was still very, very close at a 1.2% margin of victory, but Ossoff was able to get more Democratic voters out to vote for him as Senate control hanged in the balance, and Ossoff was able to win a very close race against David Perdue. So the only recent election history based off David Perdue we have to go off of is this is going to be a very close race that right now I'm currently forecasting to go to a runoff election. It's possible Ossoff wins outright. I think it's pretty unlikely the Republican wins outright. It's possible Ossoff can win on election night, but I think it's more likely it's probably going to go to a runoff. And as for what that means for 2026 is very important. Because right now there are 3 Senate races I'm viewing as toss-ups right now: Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, with New Hampshire and Maine also potentially being competitive, but starting out as lean right now. I fully expect that Jon Ossoff is going to win this race by a lean Democratic margin, which is in between a 1 and 5% margin of victory after a runoff election. On election night, I wouldn't be shocked to see Ossoff only winning by under 1 point. Maybe the Republican may even be doing a little bit better. But I think Ossoff, when it goes to a runoff, will end up winning. But if the Republicans could find a way to defeat Jon Ossoff in the state of Georgia, well, for one, that would mean that probably Republicans are having a much better night than 2026 is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a very strong night for the Democrats. If the Republicans are beating Jon Ossoff in Georgia, the Republicans are likely having a good night as well in North Carolina and maybe even Michigan. But again, I really don't think at this point in time that's the most likely scenario. I think it's more likely that Georgia remains for the Democrats and North Carolina and Michigan are coming down to the wire, like under 1% margin of victory. But Georgia is one of 3 Senate races that I think hold very, very huge potential for 2026 and which party will hold the majority in the U.S. Senate. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below, tell me your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video.